Alrighty, we're a little bit thin here, but I know people trickle in late, but I want to get started with at least the introductions here. Welcome back to the Wildfire Seminar Series. I'm Derek Fong, if you haven't met me before. I want to acknowledge that this series would not be possible without the support of the Bill Lane Center for the American West, Woods Institute, and Stanford Sustainability Data Science. And we're hoping that this is just a great dialogue for people to just learn more about wildfires and talk to people who have thought about these problems of importance. And hopefully this will lead the way to solutions that will help us in this space. And if you're listening to the recordings, I hope you'll continue to join us, and hopefully you can join us live for some of these in the remaining weeks here on Tuesday afternoons at 12:30. So welcome back. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce this week's speaker, who I'm so grateful has taken the time to be with us. We have Bill Clerico in the house. He is the founder and managing partner at Convective Capital, an early stage venture capital fund investing in solutions to the wildfire crisis. Splitting his time between San Francisco and Mendocino County, Bill loves both the forests of Northern California and the energy and pace of Silicon Valley. He is passionate about the potentials of startups to create new tools for firefighters, policymakers, utilities, insurance companies, landowners, and other stakeholders in order to restore a healthy relationship with fire. Prior to starting Convective Capital, Bill was co-founder and CEO of WePay, a fintech company which was acquired by JP Morgan Chase in 2017. I've only known Bill, I guess, for a little bit over a year, but he has been a remarkable collaborator and a free spirit, or say a free thinker, who I think has some really outside the box creative thoughts and a passion for this huge problem which we are facing as a society. So I think he will shed much needed light into some areas that may help us in the years ahead. So with that being said, Bill, welcome. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn over the controls to you.
Thanks, Derek. Great to be here, talking to you and your group, and recognize some names in the on Zoom here. So good to be chatting with some folks that I've crossed paths with. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and hopefully that works. All right, does that all look good in terms of sharing? Perfect. So anyway, it's really nice to be here again, chatting with this group, talking about wildfire and what we can do about it. I think there's wildfire is a really complicated issue, and there's a number of sort of layered solutions that are necessary. So I don't profess to be an expert at solving the overall problem, but I come at this with a technology lens, with kind of the belief that technology can augment a lot of our existing efforts and create new capabilities. And so I'm here to talk about that lane today. Derek shared a little bit about my background, but just real quickly, there's kind of three hats that I think about wearing as I come to this challenge. One is as a company builder and an operator. I was the founder and CEO of WePay, which I started a year out of undergrad when I was 23, and we built and sold that over the course of a decade. Then I've been an investor, so I've been an early stage investor in about 50 early stage technology companies. Did some later stage investing when I was at JP Morgan, and worked at Y Combinator for 2 years as a part-time partner. And then the third hat I wear is someone that really cares deeply about this issue and is a believer that we can solve it. I own some land up in Mendocino County. And what actually got me into wildfire was that we had a 90-acre fire burn along the access road to that property. And it was a real eye-opening moment for me in terms of, safety of a place I care a lot about, safety of, my family. And the more I learned about wildfire, the more I thought that technology could play a role in that. So that's kind of where I come at this problem from personally. I'm sure you all have talked about this a little bit, but want to just share a little bit of background. I believe the wildfire crisis is in part a climate crisis. The annual CO2 emissions from wildfire is about 5% of global energy emissions. And so that's, more than the country of Russia and the entire US transportation sector. So it's a lot of carbon. One of the stats from this year is that Canada's carbon emissions this year are projected to be 3x what they are in a normal year. And that, over the last decade, California's forests have become net emitters of carbon, not carbon sinks. And so pretty staggering statistics as you think about, the climate impacts of wildfire. And of course, there's this really negative feedback loop, right? Which is, fire releases carbon, which contributes to a warming climate. A warming climate creates longer, hotter, drier fire seasons and more fire. And so it's this real sort of negative feedback loop. I think the good news is that, unlike I think some other aspects of decarbonization, I think wildfire can be solved, in a matter of years or maybe a decade or two, at least having extreme wildfire become a thing of the past. So there's a really, I think near-term impact opportunity here. If we can interrupt this cycle, we could potentially reduce global carbon emissions by several percentage points over the course of, say 10 or 15 years. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity. You think about the opportunity to do that relative to the opportunity to do that in transportation or energy generation, where there's a lot more capital, a lot more time required. I think that being said, wildfire is not exclusively a climate crisis. There's several things that contributed to our current wildfire crisis. Certainly, longer, hotter, drier fire seasons are part of it. But the other thing that really contributes to it is that for the last 100 years, we've been very aggressive in putting out fire. And so now our forests, some experts estimate, are about 3 times denser than they were 100 years ago, because we interrupted this very natural cycle of fire. And so what we have today is a lot more energy, a lot more chemical energy, and a lot more fuel in these same forests. And that's 3 times the amount of straws competing for water as well in these forests. And so that policy of suppression has really contributed to in part, what we see today, which is really extreme fire behavior that is not natural or normal when you look at it on a historical timeline. The other thing that we've done is, we built a bunch of houses out in places where houses didn't exist. Over the last 2 decades, the wildland urban interface, which is sort of the area between, the wildland and urban areas, grew about 40%. So we've really built huge amounts of housing there. And as you think about housing policy, regionally or nationally even, I always like to hold up San Francisco as an example, because I live here in San Francisco. If we don't build houses here in San Francisco, that means they get built somewhere else out in the wildland, in places that are, that are dangerous to live and contribute to this crisis. So, housing policy and housing costs really contribute to the wildfire crisis as well. And the last piece is that we have a really fragile, aging power grid. This power grid, PG&E has 200,000 miles of highly energized metal running through this tinderbox. And it's really not surprising when you think about it that way, that every now and then they start fires that, some of which can be really destructive. And the same conditions that lead to, power equipment failures, basically high winds, are also those same conditions that lead to, really explosive fire behavior. And so, thinking about the role of the energy industry and the energy sector in this is important. And you can see a chart on the right. Again, these sort of mega fires greater than 100,000 acres, are a relatively recent phenomenon. Not that they didn't happen before, but nowhere at the same frequency that they're occurring today. Unfortunately, the projections are it's going to get worse. And so, if you look at this projection from NASA Ames, this is a change in extreme fire risk days, and you can look, in the Western U.S. and in South America and in Africa and in Australia and parts of Asia and Europe. The forecasts are for far more fire extreme days. 25 or 50 days may not seem like a lot, but if you think of the summer as really only about 90 days, it's really a 50% increase in the number of days where we may see extreme fires. So certainly some sobering statistics. I think so what, I think is sort of an important question to sort of ask. And I think folks, when they think about the impacts of wildfire, they might think of a documentary they've seen or something where there's the direct immediate impact of, someone running from the flames or losing their home. And that's certainly a really serious impact of wildfire. But I think it actually pales in comparison to the broader impacts that are felt at the regional or even global level. Certainly you've got loss of life and loss of property, but you've also got huge impacts to air quality. You've got huge impacts to public spending and workforces, huge impacts to the insurance markets and real estate values, the carbon impacts that we talked about, biodiversity loss, watershed impacts. So, these are, sometimes these sort of externalities to the immediate fire get overlooked, but the costs are sort of far greater in many ways and broader. And so this is not an issue that people that live in rural Northern California or Montana should care about. It's really a national and global issue that impacts all of us. Certainly we saw that this past summer with the smoke on the East Coast. And the way it sort of impacted lawmakers in New York City and all that. Speaking of air quality, because I think this is actually one of the biggest impacts of wildfire that's really not yet understood. The group at Ames, did some analysis where they modeled PM 2.5 levels at NASA Ames, and you can see, sort of current levels are, on average, sort of in the 5 to 10 range, depending on the year, with a big spike when we had the red sky day back in 2020. Unfortunately, if you use sort of the baseline climate models and use that to project air quality, that will be an average summer here in the 2070s. And I don't think any of us that lived through that, week or two want that to be an average summer. And so I think it's a really sobering statistic too about how important solving this issue is, not just because of the immediate local impacts, but because of the regional and health impacts that'll be at a national and global level. I'm an investor, so it's also worth, I think, talking about the economic impacts. This is actually a Senate study that was just published yesterday. So I forgive the graphics of my rough copy and paste here, but the staffers that worked on this in the Senate estimated that climate exacerbated wildfires could cost as much as $900 billion per year when you include all of the sort of economic impacts. So that's, to put that in perspective, the high end of that range, 900 billion, is about 4% of US GDP. So huge impact. You could think about if you were to be able to reduce this, you could have massive economic growth levers. And an actual statistic from this year is that economists are forecasting that Canadian GDP will actually be about 1/4 point lower this year because of the Canadian wildfire. So, these fires have enormous, economic impacts. And this chart tells a little bit more of that. They impact real estate value. They impact, tourism, people going outside, exposure to smoke, income loss, watersheds, insurance losses, timber losses, property damage, energy costs, suppression costs. So it's a really serious thing. And as you can see here, the suppression costs are actually a small sliver of the overall impact that's caused by these fires. Okay, tried to make the point. It's a big deal, and we should focus on it. Let's be a little more optimistic. Can we solve it? And I think the answer to that question is definitively yes. It just requires some real commitment, and I think we actually know what the answers are. Back in 2014. We published a national strategy which had 3 pillars: resilient landscapes. We need to basically restore healthy forests. We need to build fire-adapted communities. So build towns and cities and properties and homes and infrastructure that's fire resilient. And then to be able to safe and effectively intervene when it's called for. And I think that strategy holds true today. Those are the right ways to kind of think about it. Although we are in the process of a big national review right now to kind of revisit this strategy, which is also looking at workforce and the role of workforce in accomplishing these things. But implementation of this has been really challenged. We've made some progress since 2014, but I think we'd all agree, we have a long ways to go. So why is now the right time to solve this? And so I think there's a bunch of trends that some favorable, some unfavorable, but sort of contribute to now being the right time to sort of have a breakthrough. One, we have record funding from the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bills to actually fund some of the work that needs to happen here. We've got the Red Sky Day and sort of related incidents that have created broad public awareness. Some of the really poor air quality on the East Coast this summer, while kind of a negative for people living there, I think in some ways we're a positive because it brought broader national awareness to particularly the lawmakers that wildfire is not some Western issue. It's truly a national issue. We've seen the bankruptcy of utilities. PG&E went through bankruptcy, but Hawaiian Electric, the stock is down about 70-something% since the Lahaina fire this year. And so these are not small amounts of dollars being lost by shareholders and these companies. And so there's real motivation to kind of do something about it and solve these issues. I think there's a cultural shift that's really well in progress away from sort of pure suppression to this sort of mindset of suppression meets mitigation, and how do we sort of invest in resilience and do things that are not just about firefighting, but also sort of creating a safer environment around fire. We see the insurance market here on the verge of collapse in California, which is going to have massive implications for real estate and homeowners if that's allowed to continue, and so create sort of a timely moment. And then last but not least, I think that the role of technology in this, we're at a point where many of these technologies are well commercialized and understood and sort of waiting to be applied to this problem. And so, these sort of 6 trends, I think, are all kind of coming together to make it a really unique time to think about, really solving this problem for the next generation. And so, out of those, I'm going to talk about Firetech. That's my background and around technology. And really, Firetech sort of this basic concept that's saying, hey, there's a bunch of really interesting and powerful technologies that have been built and commercialized in tons of other use cases. And rather than apply AI to marketing software, could we apply AI to wildfire? Could we apply these sort of technologies that are well proven in other spaces to help us solve a really important problem? And thinking about the intersection of these technology themes with these solution lanes, and how can the physical world and new compounds or mobility or software help us build resilient landscapes or fire after communities or safe and effective response. And there's a really rich sort of meeting of those two frameworks that I think is a really big opportunity for entrepreneurs and for technologists. A lot of people ask me, okay, hey, Bill, that's really great. We'd love to see cool technology, but who's going to pay for this stuff? And I think, while there's sort of really large macroeconomic impacts of fire, I think there's also sort of more microeconomic impacts as well, where there's actual real companies and people there that are sort of feeling this pain and are willing to pay for it. The first is obviously the insurance industry. They're taking, an average of $10+ billion of losses to wildfire per year in the US, which is really significant. The insurance industry in California, if you do a 5-year look back, it's just not profitable in the aggregate because of wildfire risk. And the exposure is huge, over $1 trillion of home value in the wildland-urban interface. 60 million homes are within 1 mile of a wildfire that's occurred in the last 20 years. So there's a huge amount of exposure. And I believe that these companies are willing to pay for solutions. Utilities we talked a little bit about, but there's huge penalties in terms of fines, financial liability, regulatory requirements to spend on wildfire mitigation. In the timber and forestry industry, there's huge impacts obviously as trees burn. A lot of these timber parcels are owned by large REITs and large institutional capital holders that are very much willing to pay to protect their investments. The real estate industry, we see skyrocketing demand for home hardening and defensible space, new building codes that need to be adapted to, increasing homeowner demand for this stuff too, as people just want to protect their assets. Excuse me. The hospitality industry, nothing. I think if you remember the Red Sky Day a couple years ago, the occupancy in Tahoe really plummeted. Then you can think of the amount of tourism impact that happens. No one wants to go outside when there's when the air quality is 400. So thinking about how to build solutions for the hospitality industry, I think is a really interesting opportunity. And then last but not least, public dollars and public safety, I think are also a really willing customer. The agencies are really overwhelmed by the intensity of these seasons. They face really tremendous staffing issues. And so helping them think about new ways to get efficiency and to help solve this problem, I think is also a really big opportunity. So the direct spend on wildfire in the US is, I believe, around $50 billion a year. So who are we? So, I'm a venture capitalist. I have a $35 million investment fund. I back early stage companies that are building technology solutions to the wildfire crisis. I'll talk a little bit more about my portfolio here in a second, but we really like to get involved at the early stages of company formation, whether it's, could be a team and an idea, or it could be, some initial revenue and some initial customers, and need some, kind of early committed capital to help that scale up. And so our portfolio today spans, a number of these different themes. It ranges from companies like BurnBot that have built equipment for better vegetation management and forest resilience. Companies like Rain that build autonomous aircraft to do fire suppression. Companies like StationWise, which are sort of vertical software for fire stations to better manage and optimize staffing. Companies like Pano that build camera systems to help detect fire early and accurately across large swaths of landscape. I think in addition to funding companies ourselves, we really try to help bring other venture investors into this ecosystem, because I think in addition to it being really important, impactful work, there's a huge commercial opportunity here. And maybe I would just highlight, because this is Stanford. I think 3 of these companies have some deep Stanford roots. Pano CEO Sonia went to the GSB. Winborn was started by a group of undergrads out of Stanford, and StationWise was started by a graduate of the GSB as well. So lots of good Stanford DNA here. So hopefully the next portfolio company might be listening to this. I think lastly, what I would say is that we've really tried to build a movement around Firetech, and there's a huge sort of unlock of excitement and opportunity here of founders and entrepreneurs building, of community members coming out to try to help and support this. We've hosted a dinner every year for folks in this community, and the first year is that middle graphic. We had like 40 something people. The next year is this sort of picture here on the left where we had 100 and something people. This year we're hosting a full day conference, which we expect to be over 200 people. So there's really, I think, a lot of momentum around this community and people building real solutions, and not just founders and entrepreneurs and scientists, but folks from the public sector and agencies that are really interested in helping try new stuff. Folks from the utility sector and the timber sector and the insurance sector that all want to try new stuff. So I think, while it's a really large, sobering, daunting problem, I think it's also there's a lot of folks here that really believe in the power of technology and innovation to do something new about it. And so I think that's a really exciting and inspiring thing, and that I feel lucky to work with so many amazing, inspiring people. So that's a little bit about my pitch on why technology can impact this problem. And I think with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions or talk more about various areas that might be of interest to the group here.
Well, Bill, it was great, and I'm grateful that you left a lot of time for questions. So I'm hoping people can ask their questions and be part of the discussion. Ozir, why don't you just unmute yourself, and why don't you ask your question?
Hey there, my name is actually Mac. I'm borrowing my friend's phone to get on here because my phone died.
Hey, Mac.
I also am not a Stanford student. A friend of mine is at Stanford. I'm actually at Wharton, so thank you all for having me. Bill, I wanted to ask you about your market map. My phone died right as that slide was being pulled up, but I'm curious what you think about carbon accounting and carbon removal. If you think it fits into this space, or just in general, where your head is at on that as a particular sector within Firetech.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think in general, carbon accounting and is becoming more and more important, right? There's regulatory requirements that are going into effect, or requiring companies to disclose their emissions and offset them, or find ways to sort of mitigate them. And California is passing some legislation there that's driving requirements. So I think there's a lot of reasons to believe that that is going to be an important market over the next couple of years. I think where it intersects with Firetech is mostly around forestry, and I think initially there was a lot of excitement around forest-based carbon credits, And I think over the last year or two or three, there's been sort of increasing skepticism around forest-based carbon credits because there's varying levels of quality and sort of accountability around the ability of forests to sort of provide a true carbon credit. And I think one of the other reasons that there's increasing skepticism about that is that they're not necessarily permanent carbon credits, because you do have things like wildfires that can, scorch a forest, release a bunch of carbon, and then, that block of land that you got paid to sort of preserve and protect, quickly evaporates. And so, I do think that there is a role for Firetech technology companies to help protect forests against, particularly ones that are, receiving carbon credits or sort of throwing off carbon credits from wildfire. And there needs to be a better solution around that. I also think accounting for the carbon emissions that come from wildfire might help us think about prioritizing resources towards this problem as we think about spending down, our investing against our emissions potential. So, at a high level, I think it's super exciting. I think the devil is in the details of like, who can you find that will actually buy solutions for this today? And I think, that can be a little bit challenging, given sort of the industry is a little bit skeptical about forest-based credits at the moment.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Great question and response. Mark, you're next.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Bill, I really appreciate the technology aspect of this. I flew the U.S. Forest Service Firewatch Cobra for 13 seasons from 2009 to 2021. And I'm very familiar with your part of the state up there because we're based out of Reading. The question I have for you is, with all this technology and private sector investment and development, how are you incorporating that with existing, fire suppression that takes place now? And or are you working with governmental agencies to do that? Or is this kind of a separate stovepipe?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and thanks for bringing your experience to bear here. No, I think the partnership with the public sector is critical, and I think there's many ways to think about that. I think, first and foremost, I think there's an opportunity for private companies to build solutions for public agencies to purchase or use. And I think our investment in Pano, I think, is a great example of that. Pano builds a camera-based system which can go on mountaintops. They sell that system to utilities and sort of the private sector, but also to the public agencies. They're a really close partnership with the Aspen Fire Department in Colorado, for example. And so I think there's an opportunity for them to just directly build solutions for the public sector. And I think also, even when the solution itself is not targeted at the public sector as a customer, it absolutely needs to interoperate with the existing apparatus and infrastructure, because a piece of technology in a vacuum is not going to go put out a fire the way an aircraft can. And so thinking, for our founders, thinking about, even if you're selling to the private sector, making sure it sort of fits in with the broader public efforts, I think is really important. That being said, I think there's like big opportunities to improve, particularly in areas around like data and standards. I found there's a lot of discrepancies. One department will use a certain system and use GIS data in a certain way, and a certain company uses it in a different way, and third company uses it a different way, and a different agency uses a different way. So one of the things that we're trying to help drive with our sort of community momentum is, can we have some conversations around open standards, so that as people are building new capabilities or new insights, that they fit into a framework where they can be easily used by different folks. And I think, candidly, there's a long way to go on that front. I don't think really that exists yet. And part of what we're trying to do is help make the public agency representatives, talented and skilled buyers of the stuff, and have a strong point of view on those standards, so they can help guide the market to the ways that are most helpful. But it's a little bit, given it's so new, I don't think that there's really a shared set of standards yet.
Yeah, I would agree with that. When you have 4 intelligence gathering platforms that show up on the same incident at the same time, getting information for different places, there's a lot of efficiencies that could be improved. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I don't have nearly the experience you do, but I've worked a little bit as a volunteer firefighter, and there's a lot going on an incident, and so like when you have an incident commander who now has to manage 4 different systems, you know, that's just unacceptable. It's not, and it won't end up getting used. And so, you know, I think there needs to be an industry push towards, you know, sort of consolidation and interoperability.
Okay, thank you.
Great question. Someone else. You can speak up, or if you're shy, you can type it in the chat, and I can bring it to voice. I got several, so I'm going to pump one in here while people come out. Oh, go ahead, Chris. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi. Thanks, Dr. Fong, for hosting this series. It's really interesting. And thanks, Bill, for bringing your slides and your speech here, because it's been very informative. I'm Chris. I'm working with my mechanical engineering capstone team with Rain. We partnered with them as our industry liaison to try to improve firefighting efficiency from airborne platforms. And so with that general concept, I'm just wondering, from your experience as a volunteer firefighter, but also just as someone who watches the industry, where are the material solutions that you think would most benefit, especially like mega firefighting or preventing mega firefighting, specifically looking at the you know, physical products that you think would provide the best benefit to those while they're fighting these fires? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks for your work with Rain. You know, I think that there's lots of opportunities in lots of areas, and you know, when you go to the physical world, I think maybe a couple things come to mind. I think one, in the sort of aerial retardant world, there's basically one option. It's a product called FOSCheck, and it's made by a company called Perimeter Solutions, and they're, you know, essentially a monopoly. They have 80+% market share. They're, you know, the only product on the U.S. Forest Service approved product list. They own a bunch of operational facilities to, you know, to sort of equip aircraft with this. And it's a fine product. I don't think it's, you know, it's a 30-year-old product. And I think there's an opportunity to think about how could we build more effective retardants that are more environmentally friendly. And I think, you know, it will work. You know, there's some structural reasons why that might be hard to do, but I think there's a big opportunity in doing so. And there's a couple challengers to that are sort of coming up, but I think that's a really ripe area to think about that. You could also think about similar products, you know, less for like aerial suppression deployment, but you know, things you could spray on vegetation or on buildings to sort of increase their survivability in a fire. I think there's a big opportunity around building materials. You know, how could we think about building more ignition resistant structures and to do it more cheaply? You know, ways that we could retrofit existing structures to make them more ignition resistant. And I think that requires some real sort of real world, you know, chemical research and sort of, you know, physical research. Yeah, those are probably the big two that come to mind. I'm sure there's others, but those are some areas that I've kind of spent some time studying. You know, when you think about, you know, new types of materials.
That's awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question, Chris. Anyone else? It's a great discussion here. Okay, I'm going to pump it again and let people queue up their questions. So, one, I appreciate everything we've talked about with last year, Bill. And one thing I sense is really great optimism from you. Maybe that's important because you need to sell, or people need to sell to you. But, you know, you said you think there's an opportunity here. We can't crack the climate change problem, but you think we can crack this in 10 to 15 years. And I don't know, I've been studying the space a little bit longer, or probably same length as you, but I guess I want to get a sense from you. You know, you've worked a lot of private companies developing these technologies. Have you been able to bring them to the table with, say, insurance companies and policymakers? Because it seems like there's potentially a disconnect, I guess. You raised one a moment ago, I think, with Mark's question about data being available. You know, CAL FIRE has got 5 systems. If you're a citizen, who do you go to for information to be safe in a fire? And so I guess I'm not sure it's a technology problem, but the question is, how do you bring the technology and these innovations to the people who need them or are willing to pay for them?
Yeah, I think there's sort of various, you know, buyers or lanes that are at various stages of maturity. in my opinion, the utilities are probably the farthest along. Like, PG&E went bankrupt. They got, fined in a really big way. There's other utilities that are dealing with similar issues, like one in Oregon and Hawaii, and they're highly motivated to like not start any more fires. It's like one of their top 3 priorities as a company. And so they're very willing to try new things, buy new things. They're investing in infrastructure upgrades. There's like, to me, that's a very healthy and advanced part of the market. I would say the public sector is probably next. It is actually like it has come a long way in the last couple of years. Still could go farther, but like, there's large dollar amounts trickling down to these big pieces of federal legislation. In California, we are investing, huge amounts in fire suppression our budget has gone up, a lot year over year. Also in fuel treatment, people are taking it really seriously. The international community is sort of realizing that they need to also do this. So there's investments happening in South America and Australia and in Europe. And so, I think while traditionally people have thought of, oh, government is not a good place to go sell technology, there's like real budgets and real need for tools here. And in many ways, there's sort of more budget than there is capacity to go deploy that budget in many parts of this. And so I think that's an interesting and opportunity for entrepreneurs to try to help close that gap. Can you provide solutions? And the money is there. I think insurers are probably next, and they're a little bit behind. They are taking lots of losses, but their strategy to sort of get out of that has just been like, okay, we're going to try to like get out of these markets. And I think the regulatory environment, particularly in California, has just been like sort of unreasonable towards insurers. They're not allowed to use CAT models to price risk. They're not allowed to include the cost of reinsurance in their models. And so guess what happens when those 2 things are true? It's totally unprofitable to write insurance in California, and so they want to just exit the market. And so I think though that there's finally, because the market is on the verge of failure, there's finally some real dialogue going on around, what are sort of reasonable rules to sort of govern those insurance markets. I think it's going to open up investment and sort of rational acting in that lane. And I think that's an opportunity. So I see things sort of starting to change. I don't think that we're in the same place that we were 5 years ago, because of these big utility driven events, because of the legislation that's been passed, because of these market failures. I think there's huge need to sort of close some of the gaps and fix some of these problems that are there. And I don't think those are necessarily just technology problems. I think there's real organization and people problems. But I'm optimistic that stuff is sort of moving. I think, one of the silver linings of all the tragedy that happens around wildfire is it dominates the headlines, and therefore really public opinion on it is pretty strong, and no one likes to see houses burned down. So it's kind of a bipartisan issue. And so I think there's a willingness to act and do stuff. But I think there's just a need for more good people sort of pushing the envelope forward.
Thank you. And again, I appreciate your optimism. I'm not a pessimist, but we've heard some sobering talk so far this quarter, especially related to the insurance policies, because the insurance companies, and following along what's happening in Sacramento, and whether these recent, we should call them, things by the governor and the insurance commissioner are going to make any traction with bringing Allstate and State Farm back into the fold, and what consumer advocates are going to think about that.
I think that's far from solved. And if it doesn't get solved, it's going to be a massive disservice to Californians. And I think our elected officials need to really own that in partnership with the industry. And so there's good reason for consumer advocates to push for lower prices, but if you don't have a healthy market, then the whole thing falls apart. And so we got to get that right. And if we don't, it's going to be a tragedy.
Yeah, I mean, they got to make they got to not be in the red, right? So
yeah.
Was it Mac? It's not Ozier. Mac, do you have it was Mac I got, or Ozier in hiding?
No, you got it, Derek. Or Dr. Fong, excuse me. Yes, thank you. Yeah, I could definitely keep going. I'm curious, Bill, if there are any corners of the Firetech market or landscape or solutionscape that you haven't invested in, but you're really excited about, or you have your eye on looking forward.
Yeah, and I think the insurance world is very topical at the moment, and I think timely and exciting. And we made a small investment in a company called Delos, but I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and so that's definitely an area that I'm spending time sort of thinking about and trying to figure out. I also think around forestry, we've made some investments, but such a big part of the solution here is we have to do fuel treatment and prescribed burning at much bigger scale. So how do you make that safer and more efficient? I think there's big things there. I think tools for the workforce is also another big category. We have, being a wildland firefighter is a really hard job. It's unsafe, it's seasonal, it's like incredibly physically taxing, it's emotionally taxing, it's taxing on your relationships. It doesn't pay well. Like we need to make that job better, safer, and more efficient, because we don't have enough people doing it. And so I think tools to help protect firefighters, whether it's respirators, whether it's other types of technology and equipment, I think there's a big opportunity there too. Just on the respirator topic, it's kind of crazy, but our wildland firefighters don't use any sort of breathing apparatus. It's just like they'll use a wet cloth or a shroud, and that's it. And so and doesn't really do anything. And whereas like all of us walking around cities are like wearing our N95 masks just to go outside. We have people on the fire line for weeks on end that wear nothing. And so you think about like the health impact of that. It's pretty astounding. And so structural firefighters obviously wear full SCBA apparatus, breathing apparatus, but you can't, that doesn't last on a fire line in the conditions that wildland firefighters do. So, that would be a hugely impactful problem if someone could build a lightweight, but safe and have long duration, breathing apparatus, for example. Or other mechanical tools. So there's big opportunities there. I think that's like you could really help people, and I think it could be a tremendous business too if it was done the right way.
Yeah, that's a great comment there, Bill, because if those of you who are at Stanford, you probably have seen this in the Stanford report. We've got several people at Stanford looking at the health effects on wildfires. I mean, I forgot, I don't want to misquote it, but I think average life expectancy of a wildland firefighter, it's like decade and a half less of the typical citizen. So it's a pretty big problem. And I don't know, I guess I'm gonna latch on one more thing, and please raise your hand if you have another question. Bill, do you have any other instincts about how to get around the human problem, or the resource problem, in terms of, like you said, there's money there for mechanical thinning, there's money there for prescribed burns, and yet there isn't a workforce or the infrastructure to accomplish. At least that's the impression I've gotten in talking to CAL FIRE and people that are managing our forest lands. Do you have any thoughts on how technology might, at least, are we on the cusp, or are we having any breakthroughs on that department so we can get more done in terms of treating our vegetation?
I think technology has a role to play, but there's actually just like a much more simpler solution. It's like we just need to pay firefighters a living wage, and I think if we do that, we will have a workforce. But there's a bill right now sitting for Congress to extend a $15 an hour pay rate. It's like, this is like, and we, Congress is Congress at the moment, but it's sort of a, we are just not paying, anywhere near what's a fair market wage for this type of work, given the dangers involved and the seasonality and all that. So it's sort of like, we got to fix that. That's just, and no amount of technology is going to solve that. So I think that's sort of part one. I think part two is then, okay, great. We can get to like some basic level of like a fair labor market. Now let's like start to think about, how do we make the job safer? How do we make the job, how do we increase the value per firefighter so that one firefighter can have a bigger disproportionate impact? Can we use more automation and equipment to sort of augment the firefighting force? So I think there's ways that technology can help accelerate, but like there's sort of this basic table stakes of like, if we're not paying people, even the most basic living wage, like, of course we have a labor issue. It's not a labor issue, it's a pay issue in my mind. There's also a labor issue, but that's like, we can solve the beginning part of it a lot more simply. these people really get
Well
screwed.
said.
It's
Yeah.
really,
Yeah.
it's kind of it's really a shame, in my mind, in terms of like what we ask them to do. And so we get a lot of young people that go into it because it's sort of fun and an adventure. And then, as they spend a couple of years in it, they start to cycle out because, it's very hard it's not compatible with, the life that many of us, want to lead. And so, we need to fix that.
Great. Thanks for those insights. Bill, you went off mute. So do you have a question or comment?
I apologize. I just got asked earlier. I was just offline for a little while. So a lot of us have been looking at, what happened in Maui, and then we think back to the lessons we might have learned from places like Campfire and things like that, and we don't seem to be applying the lessons that we've learned. And you mentioned that organizational changes were one of the things we need to achieve. So how do we do this?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's fire is really dynamic. It's like and Maui's a great example. Like the fire itself was probably, I think it was like 3,000 acres, maybe even less. And it was a relatively small fire, but it was incredibly fast moving. And I don't think the reports are kind of fully out yet in terms of what exactly happened and what the failures were. But, from what I understand, it was sort of a utility caused fire. There was some initial suppression activity that was sort of timely, but then maybe wasn't completely done, or there was sort of a flare up. I think that part is still kind of under investigation. So, it's hard to say, okay, there was some specific thing that should have happened. Like certainly utilities need to sort of share best practices and, better think about how they're going to prevent fire. And I believe actually what happened is, and again, this is a little bit secondhand knowledge, but I believe that, Hawaiian Electric considered doing public safety power shutoffs in the case of wildfire, which is one of the learnings of the Campfire. But opted not to because of the outcry from customers that they were going to lose power on high risk days, and potentially that could have prevented this fire from happening if that was actually implemented. But the problem is like it's not always like an obvious yes. It's not like yep, we should do public safety power shutoffs, because in doing so you put a lot of people at risk, and people lose their power many days a year, and it's like not there's sort of these trade-offs. And so I think like why don't we all implement those same best practices? I think it's because maybe different communities have different views on the sort of cost benefit of those types of trade-offs. I think we should take it more seriously and err more on the side of avoiding these disasters. But it's a little bit hard, I think, to really internalize that until it happens in your community or in your backyard. I don't think any of us would have expected to have a massive wildfire on an island, right up to the ocean until recently. Just like a couple of years ago, we wouldn't have expected to have the Marshall Fire on, 2 days after Christmas in Colorado. So, it's I think helping, collectively taking this risk more seriously and erring on the side of caution might be part of the reason why we're not adopting all that stuff. I'm not quite sure. That's a little bit of speculation.
I often wonder if we should have something like the NTSB. So when an airplane crashes, you go and you study it, and then everybody has to do something different so we don't have that accident again.
Yeah.
So, just a thought.
Yeah, I think that having something like that seems like it would be really valuable. I think the challenge is it cuts across so many. The NTSB regulates transportation, right? And so you can change. The FAA can enforce new laws or policies or whatever. Whereas wildfire is so interdisciplinary, whether it's utility, insurance, public safety, transportation, communication, firefighting. So it's maybe more difficult to have like a common set of standards or framework. But I think, we should at least study it and understand it and, try to do that, right? And we can, argue about the complexity later, but, we should try it.
Mark, did you go off mute for another question?
I was just going to add that is done. At the end of a large incident or a small incident for that matter, there's after action reviews that are completed. And particularly when it becomes something that has a lot of public interest. There's a lot of staff rides and there's revisiting sites and taking a look at what happened, what was the environmental characteristics that might have caused a certain thing to occur. So I wouldn't want anyone to think that, some analysis isn't done. I know from the aerial supervision perspective, that was a big deal for us. There was always a push to get into the origin of a fire while it was ongoing so that they could study, where did it start, what happened, and why is it taking the course that it is.
Thanks for sharing that insight, Mark. That's really helpful. We are at 1:22, but if Bill's okay, I'll at least open the floor for at least one more question, if people have any.
Sure.
I guess we're good. This was a really rich discussion, and Bill, I appreciate you having a shorter talk so we had time for a nice rich discussion. And if anyone wants to follow up with Bill, I assume I can share his email with you. So you can follow up with Bill. Bill's really a generous soul and really has a passion, as I hope you were able to ascertain based on his remarks and comments today. Thanks again for joining us this week, and hope to see you again next week. We have a great series coming up, and looking forward to seeing some of you. Have a great day, everybody. Be safe.
Thanks.